G'day to all of our viewers in Australia, the United States, Israel, and the rest of the world. We've always had a special guest, but today's one is super special. He's none other than the world's leading cognitive scientist, linguist, Professor Steven Pinker from Harvard University. Steven and I first met at Harvard in 2016, and we have since stayed in touch and swapped notes on many topics. Steven has written more books than can be listed in one particular webinar introduction. Among these, you will find global bestsellers, The Language Instinct in 1994, How the Mind Works, 1997, The Blank Slate, 2002, The Better Angels of Our Nature, 2011, and Enlightenment Now, which was his recent book in 2018. We will be chatting about some of Steven's core arguments in these books in today's webinar. Now, it goes without saying, a lot has been happening around the world from the political, philosophical, cultural, and linguistic points of view. So there's no shortage of topical issues for us to discuss. Also joining this conversation is my good friend and colleague, who is also a world-renowned linguist and revivalist, Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann. Professor Shalom. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So, Steve, I want to start with you. Let's start with this phenomenon that's come to be known as cancel culture. I know that you've recently come out and stood up for free speech. Good on you for doing that. How did modern society get to the point that it has, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, there are worthy causes, the fight against racism, the fight against economic unfairness, the fight against suppression of women and gay people. It created an opening where you can use accusations of racism and sexism because they are so heinous as a way of demonizing your rivals and your enemies. And we know from the history of totalitarian societies that once you give people the means to turn in enemies of the moral order, they will use it to prosecute their various personal and professional rivalries. It can also be part of a coalition, a tribe that will then, rather than having as its goal identifying instances of injustice, will basically target an entire rival coalition for zero-sum combat. It's a mindset that kind of verges into the Marxist analysis of history as involving a dialectical conflict between economic classes, but it's been adapted now to a conflict between races and genders and sexual orientations. And it's very different from the idea that we all share certain principles, that injustice comes from the fact that people have been denied equal treatment under those principles. This really sees the course of society as group against group warfare, and that where the attempt to converge on the truth, the attempt to abide by universal moral principles is just considered to be one more tactic of justification of power. So it's a very different view of the world than the more, what I would have been calling a kind of Enlightenment worldview.
Definitely, I absolutely agree with you. And to be clear, I guess we're not entirely disagreeing with some of the diagnoses of a wider problem that some of these people who support cancel culture might be trying to convey to the world. Am I right in saying that what we're disagreeing with is more the prescription? Is that roughly accurate, you think, or do you also disagree with that?
Well, I think it's more than the prescription, because in the kind of social justice warfare, cultural Marxism, intersectionality, it goes by various names that overlap and refer to various things. There's a different diagnosis of the problem, namely whether there are ideals that our society that modern liberal democracies are committed to, which are often breached, and it's these breaches that must be repaired. That is, prejudice or unfair treatment against racial or sexual minorities or women, as opposed to the idea that there is a inherent conflict between power blocks, white males versus people of color and women versus men, and that we're prosecuting a struggle for power among them, a struggle for power that is ineluctable, you can't get out of it, and where principles and conformity to principles are kind of beside the point. It's just who has the reins of power and who is under their thumb. That's very different from saying there are principles of fairness and we have to rectify the violations of them.
I would like to ask Steve, if I may, Sherry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to link Sherry's questions to your seminal 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And firstly, I would like to ask whether the recent Orwellian cancel culture attacks against you personally change anything in your views about the decline of human violence. This is a general question. But then, especially about the group vis-a-vis group that you've just mentioned, I just wonder, I would like to understand the collectivism versus the individualism, because I remember in your book, you mentioned the pacification process in which the anarchy of hunting, gathering, and horticultural societies there is a transition to the first agricultural civilizations with cities and governments, and this began around 5,000 years ago, and that brought a reduction to the chronic raiding and feuding that characterized life in a state of nature, and a more or less fivefold decrease in rates of violence, death. So you mention here the fact that collectivism actually caused the reduction of violence. But what I see here with cancel culture, and I think that you've just mentioned that as group to group and the power of the group, it's actually collectivism as the corroborator of violence. In other words, in Europe, which is kind of very individualistic, you might see decrease of violence because it's becoming more and more individualistic, whereas collectivist societies are very violent. So I just wonder whether you can put the cancel culture within the collectivism culture, which is violent and Orwellian, as you yourself says, and whether it contradicts this idea that from individuals or hunter, we went into collections, and therefore there was a decrease of violence. So my question, if I summarize it, is collectivism causing more violence, or is it decreasing violence?
Yeah, so cancel culture has not been literally violent. They've ended careers, they've tried to end reputations, but there haven't been any assassinations or pogroms. I mean, that's one thing you can say for it. But it is a step backwards in terms of I think the principles that have allowed both government and individual violence to decrease, and that have allowed for the flourishing of humans in general. And you're right that I have argued that the imposition of the first governments, the first states, led to an overall reduction in the rate of violence, but it was kind of collectivist in the sense that it was a governing elite that pacified a much larger population. It was not what remained to be invented, and that took another couple of thousand years, really, until the Enlightenment, is the idea that the only legitimate application of power is not class versus class, coalition versus coalition, a ruling class versus a population, but rather that power has to come from a social contract, namely that in order to secure rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as the American Declaration of Independence puts it, governments are implemented, they're kind of gadgets, they're tools, that the people who are granted some degree of power serve at the pleasure of the people that they govern, and that they are representative of the people empowered only to wield as much force as is necessary to prevent greater force and to provide public goods. So under the idealization of government from the Enlightenment, in modern democracies, it isn't or shouldn't be coalition against coalition, or actually more accurately, hierarchy, where it's probably the mental model of government, of monarchy, of totalitarian governments, is probably to some extent borrowed from our primate heritage of dominance hierarchies, where the powerful wield force over the less powerful. Governments, by definition, wield power, but the Enlightenment ideal is that they do so only by following the rules of a social contract. So that was another innovation. And I do think, but you're right, getting back to your overall line of questioning, I think that whole mindset that structures of power are legitimated to the extent that they are social contracts, that institutions wield power with the consent of the government through at least the fiction of a social contract, is very different from the idea that history is just driven ineluctably by conflict between coalitions. Okay? And that, you're right, is, I think, inherent to the general postmodern cancel culture, critical theory, Marxist family of interlocking ideas. Not all the same idea, but they draw strength from each other.
No, in your groundbreaking book, the 2011 book, you talked about the development of violence throughout human history. But what we see today, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we are seeing the power of both weapons and surveillance. Much of the catastrophic level of violence that took place in the first half of the 20th century can be ascribed to the weapon nature rather than to human nature. The war brought about nuclear weapons and what we call mutually assured destruction, MAD. Looking at the period since the Second World War, am I wrong that the reduction of violence has been due to fear of nuclear escalation? And is it the case that the moment we kind of lose this control, which, by the way, also has all the surveillance technology, etc., we might see a huge, large explosion of violence that we have never seen before? So, I mean, my question is whether, besides human nature, we have here at stake weapon nature, and the fact that we do not have a huge war, it's because we are very afraid to lose control of everything. So, I mean, does it weaken the idea or not?
Yeah, I do discuss the hypothesis, something called the nuclear peace hypothesis. The idea that, as one political scientist put it, that the nuclear bomb should be given the Nobel Peace Prize. That's one hypothesis for the so-called the long peace, the fact that since 1945, there were no confrontations between the Cold War superpowers on the battlefield. There were proxy wars, but not direct wars. There'd been a general decline in interstate wars between countries, although there was a rise in civil wars, which has since also come down. There have not been wars between rich countries, and we almost take that for granted, that France and Germany aren't going to fight a war against each other. But of course, for most of human history, they were at each other's throats all the time. So there was a transformation, and the question is what caused it. And there is the hypothesis that it was the countries were scared straight. They didn't want to escalate to the possibility of nuclear confrontation. So I deal with that hypothesis. I am drawing on the work of international relations scholars. I cast doubt on it. I'm skeptical of it for a number of reasons. One of them is that it's probably true, almost certainly true, that the great powers and developed countries certainly didn't want a repeat of World War II. After 1945, the world kind of said, well, let's not do that again. On the other hand, the destruction from conventional warfare, from the massive numbers of tanks and planes and artillery from World War II, which in Europe was fought with no nuclear weapons, but still left Europe in ashes, showed that there's plenty of incentives to avoid a major war even without nukes. Also, the destruction from nuclear weapons is so massive and indiscriminate that there was probably after 1962 a taboo against using or directly threatening the use of nuclear weapons, even the smaller tactical nuclear weapons. It was considered a line that would be, if crossed, would take the world into a unthinkably horrific place, which is why many of the wars that were fought as if nuclear weapons didn't exist. You often had a non-nuclear power provoking a nuclear power, which is exactly what should not have happened, precisely because they knew that the possession of nuclear weapons is kind of a bluff because they were so horrifically destructive. So for example, when Argentina retook the Falkland Islands from Great Britain, they had high confidence that Margaret Thatcher was not going to nuke Buenos Aires. When Sadat invaded the Israeli-held Sinai in 1973, Israel was a nuclear state, Egypt wasn't, but they just knew that Israel wasn't going to nuke Cairo, and so on. Many, many such examples. As recently as Saddam Hussein defying George W. Bush in 2003, knowing that Bush was not going to use nukes. Also, the decline of interstate warfare also applied to pairs of non-nuclear states, which also, contrary to the pattern of history, did not fight wars between naval gunboats, tank battles, even though neither of them had nukes to threaten the other. Canada and Spain did not go to war over fish, even though there was some escalations. So for all those empirical reasons, I suspect that even if nuclear weapons had not existed, there would still have been a decline in major war and interstate war after 1945.
I think, Stephen, one of the interesting points to note here that I feel is often left out of the conversation is that going to war for the sake of going to war was pretty much the default modus operandi, and it has been. I mean, 95% of human history was spent in the hunter-gatherer times. And so that 5% that we're talking about is post-civilization, post-pottery, post-agriculture, post-writing systems, somewhere around ancient Sumer, which would be ancient Iraq in modern terms. And so as soon as we start to, by we, I mean humans, our ancestors start to gather themselves in small city-states around the Euphrates and Tigris and so forth, they have this need for written laws. They have, surplus like they never had before, and they want to, protect that. And then over time, I think somehow there was a realization somewhere along the way that attack is the best form of defense. So territorial expansionism kind of just became the norm, and it would remain so pretty much until World War II. And as we've discussed previously, Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro have written a very interesting book, The Internationalists, which I believe came out in 2017 from memory. In that, they make the point that in 1928, there was a pact known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact between the US and France to try and have a crack at policing war, to put an end to it. Now, I know that sometimes when people do talk about this topic, they'll often, according to me anyway, somewhat mistakenly end up referring to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 as the time when the nation state starts to emerge. You could say that perhaps that sowed the seeds for the proto-state. It certainly put demarcation of territorial sovereignty on the map, but really it actually took until World War II for the world to start realizing that we can't go on like this forever. As that quote often says, that if there is a World War III, then World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. It's often attributed to Einstein. I don't know if he ever actually said it, but it's an interesting quote. So when we look at, there's a lot of implications in talking about this, and I've been in conversation with Una and Scott about this. Bringing this argument out beyond academia into the public domain actually has multiple consequences. In the first instance, Steve, it helps us understand that, how we often end up reacting to colonialism. it happens in your country, it happens in my country here. We have a big debate, and some of this sort of ties up with what we were talking about before with cancel culture. Something horrible happened in the past. There is a certain class of people that represents that horribleness, and therefore we have to fight against that group. That kind of mindset. A large part of that, don't you think, that stems from a failure to understand that whatever happened back then was pre-World War II, and it was anybody's game. It was kind of like musical chairs, and the music only stops at the end of World War II. Talk us through your thoughts.
Yeah, the Hathaway and Shapiro book came out after The Better Angels of Our Nature.
Yes.
So it was a hypothesis about the decline of war, or the long peace, that I did not explicitly consider. I considered a trio of hypotheses that are sometimes called the liberal peace, namely that war declined because of the spread of democracy, because democracies are somewhat less likely to fight each other. The spread of trade, because trading partners are less likely to fight each other. You don't kill your customers. And the rise of international organizations. If you kind of belong to the same club, you see the same leaders, you've got your interests are enmeshed, you're in the habit of writing agreements and treaties, then you're less likely to kill each other. The Hathaway and Shapiro hypothesis is in the family of that third possible cause of the liberal peace, namely that war is illegal. Now that almost sounds like a bad joke, and indeed the Kellogg-Briand Pact was a kind of a laughing stock. It was when I learned it in high school, because in 1928 they outlawed war. Well, we know how well that worked out. But Hathaway and Shapiro argue that in fact it took a while for the world to really sign on. It really did with the formation of the United Nations. And the difference is, and we take it for granted now, that war is not in the legitimate set of moves, with circumscribed exceptions like self-defense, like approval of the Security Council. But other than that, if countries are in a dispute, if one of them owes money to the other and wants to, and the creditor wants to collect it. In the past, the creditor could bite off a chunk of territory as compensation, and crucially expect the rest of the world to recognize the conquest. That's how the United States got California and Colorado and Arizona and Nevada in the war against Mexico. You kind of can't do that anymore. Not that no one ever does it. I mean, most recently, Russia chomped off Crimea, but not recognized by the world system, and a tiny fraction of the number of conquests that took place before. So this is the whole liberal piece, including Hathaway and Shapiro's amendment, is one of the arguments that there is something that is very much worth defending in the face of authoritarian populists like Donald Trump, who are trying to corrode the international system. And I have to just add that we shouldn't confuse the liberal international system with the United States. It's sometimes called the American-led post-war order, which is very misleading, because the United States is kind of a scofflaw nation when it comes to international agreements. There are dozens of treaties that the US has never gotten around to signing. The United States invaded Iraq without defying approval of the Security Council, and not in the case of credible self-defense. So the US is kind of half in, half out, and we shouldn't confuse the United States with international order.
No, not at all. And what I'll just finish that side of the conversation up, and we move on to a different topic, just by iterating, I guess, that that often when you do bring up the point that war for the sake of war only came to an end at the end of World War II, people often tend to misinterpret that as saying that war ended with World War II. Well, it clearly didn't, because almost immediately we had the Korean War, and we had the Vietnam War, which dragged on for multiple decades. We had the Soviet-Afghan War during the 80s. And plus there was also overt as well as covert regime changes, probably for very good reasons at the time, in Latin American countries, which Chomsky has written about. Well, he spent his whole career talking about it. And then there's the Gulf War, the war on terror, and the Iraq War. They're the sort of the main sticking points that come up in conversation a lot among historians and international relations specialists. But the way I look at those wars is that this is not I don't interpret the wars post World War II the same as I guess the Crusades or the 100 Years' War or the 30 Years' War. Those were fundamentally different creatures. I don't know whether you would necessarily agree with that, because see, now at least there is the prospects of recognizing that there is a world order. There are international conventions, there are treaties, there is something like the United Nations, which doesn't always get things right, but the mere fact that it exists is a reminder to people that we can't go back to the old world order. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yeah, indeed. And the decline in war took place first for war between countries, but with horrendous exceptions, such as the Korean War. The decline of civil war was later, and of course we are still in the midst of a pretty horrible civil war in Syria and civil wars elsewhere. But you're right that the existence of the United Nations and the tacit norm, thou shalt not conquer, which formerly was not stigmatized in the least, but now it's not that it never happens, but violations of all laws happen. Murders happen, even though murder is illegal. It's still good that murder is illegal compared to the alternative of anarchy. Another change, I'll just throw this in because again, it goes back to the psychology behind warfare and to the coalitional psychology that Ghil'ad mentioned, is that the code of a war as something noble, spiritual, holy, manly, healthy, invigorating, is itself new. That prior to World War I, and that probably marked the change. War was considered not a bad thing, but a good thing. Quite apart from the goals that it served. The idea was that if a country did not go to war, it would become effeminate and consumerist and decadent and hedonistic, and war called forth courage and self-sacrifice and altruism. So the code of coalitional aggression, namely that the cardinal virtue is valor, bravery, courage, was really melded with national ideologies until pretty recently. And that even when wars are fought now, it's seldom to provide opportunities for honor and valor for our young men. It's justified as preempting some greater harm.
Just so we're clear as well, for those of our listeners who are interested in post-World War II history, borders have changed. We're not saying that borders can't change since the demarcation of war, but it happens under very exceptional circumstances. I mean, India took over Goa from the Portuguese Empire from memory in 1961. As you mentioned, Russia also annexed the Crimea. Then there's also the very unique situation in Eretz Israel, right, where a lot of our viewers are watching live from now. So we can talk about that in a moment. That's obviously a very, very unique situation, incomparable with other circumstances. But I think we definitely can agree that, as I said, I mean, pre-World War II history was pretty much like anybody's game. All land, the whole world was up for grabs. It just so happens to be that in recent centuries, regimes that originated within the continent of Europe have tended to play that game better. They were fighting against each other, but they were also fighting against many of the natives, and they've tended to play that game better when the music stops. So hence we've ended up with, European civilization expanding far beyond the borders of Europe. And if people are going to react to that and people are going to criticize that as a bad thing, then I think we have to, for the sake of consistency, I personally don't criticize any colonialism that happened before World War II, because as we said, they were playing by different rules. The rules only changed 5 minutes ago. But if we're going to take the route that, all those territorial conquests were inherently a bad thing, then for consistency's sake, you've got to start criticizing the colonialism that originated out of Arabia after post-Islam. I mean, Islam originated in the Hijaz region, in Mecca and Medina, and it went all the way up to Morocco. It went all the way up to the Xinjiang province in China. So sometimes I feel there is a bit of a disparity in people only singling out Western or European colonialism, but prepared to, it's not that they're prepared to forgive everyone else's colonialism. They don't even think of it as colonialism.
Indeed, I mean, as John Mueller once put it, for millennia, the rule was stated pithily by Julius Caesar: "I came, I saw, I conquered."
Conquered.
That's just what countries did. As
Yeah.
part of the mission statement of a country, you expand the borders. You go to a list of empires in Wikipedia, and there are scores of them, maybe 100. I am kind of amused and annoyed, having written a book called Enlightenment Now, where I defend the ideas of the Enlightenment, to come up against the criticism. Well, didn't the Enlightenment justify imperialism and colonialism? Well, colonialism, imperialism was just the way things were done for millennia, and it was really during the Enlightenment that you only had the first systematic argument that imperial expansion was a bad thing. Not occasionally there would be the odd priest who would say, well, gee, these genocides against the indigenous peoples, maybe we're going a little bit too far, maybe we shouldn't be quite so murderous and cruel. But the idea that one country should not impose rule on another is really only something that emerged during the Enlightenment. But you're absolutely right. The default through most of human history is you had the Assyrian Empire and the Akkadian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. It's just like one empire after another.
It's been the historical norm. I'm going to pass it.
And in Asia.
Absolutely. I'm going to pass it back to Ghil'ad for a moment. Just tracking back to this broader conversation about free speech. It's a particular point that we left out before. We had Professor Noam Chomsky on this show a while back, and Ghil'ad and I sort of brought up the point about demarcating free speech. And I'll pass it on to Ghil'ad to talk you through the point he made up, and perhaps we can have a bit of a discussion about that. Ghil'ad, so you asked Professor Chomsky about free speech, and he brought up a couple of points. Do you want to talk, Steve, through those?
Yeah. But before that, I would just want to say that the Weni Widi Wiki that Steve mentioned, now maybe we change it to Veni Covidi Wiki, with COVID that is conquering and seeing. And look, Chomsky or Chomsky, I asked him about political correctness gone mad, whether he agrees that there is, the political correctness is not the cure. And he agreed actually that it's not the cure, but he said that, if I go to Manhattan, I wouldn't want to see all kikes, which means Jews. It's kind of derogatory. I guess it's from the circle that the Jews used to write down as opposed to the cross when they arrived in, this is one of the theories. So kaikel or kikes go way back to the crematoria. So he argued that obviously I wouldn't want to have this in Times Square. Although I have to say that if everybody in Manhattan was an anti-Semite, probably I would have wanted, and let's say I'm a tourist, I understand nothing about Manhattan. I personally, but this is very unique maybe, I would have wanted to know where I stand. So in a way, political correctness has this danger that it does not allow you to understand who is against whom. So I don't want to talk to Mel Gibson and he tells me that he loves Jews, and then obviously he kind of camouflages his anti-Semitism. So
Harvey Silverglade, a famous American civil liberties lawyer, said the best thing that could have happened to the world would be if Hitler had gone in on a speaking tour for Mein Kampf in the late 20s and early 30s. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that's consistent with your line of argument. Better we know what we're dealing with than for it to be just hidden and euphemized. That's one argument.
And I think that this ties with the first question that Sherry asked about cancel culture and in a way, who is the violent person, the one who said something that might have been perceived as politically incorrect, or actually the ones who kind of cancel him or her, etc. But I think I would like to, with Sherry's permission, to move on to the Language Instinct, which is a very, again, a seminal, groundbreaking book of 1994. So this was before, Steve, your kind of getting out of psychology and, well, not out of psychology and linguistics, but, the angels and the Enlightenment is kind of more general and political maybe, whereas the Language Instinct, like Chomsky and other generativists, you promoted the role of universal principles in language acquisition. However, we all agree that input plays a role, including statistical learning, ease of articulation, etc. And the big question, of course, is how the input, how what the child hears interplays with the universal principle. So how do they interact, this input, with the universality or universal grammar? What would you like to tell linguists who argue very vehemently against universal principles, and they believe that language knowledge is all experience-based? These linguists adhere, for example, to usage-based linguistics, for example, Michael Tomasello, cognitive linguistics, or recently also socially based language genesis views like Daniel Dor of Tel Aviv University, Nick Enfield of the University of Sydney, Nick Evans from the Australian National University. All these linguists reject universality, reject also often innateness. What is your current response to these books that are being published for experience-based language acquisition or for usage-based language acquisition as opposed to universality?
Well, it's I've always thought that it was a false dichotomy, and there's nothing new about. Often the story is told that there was a Chomskyan consensus of universal grammar, and whatever the latest book was a crack in the foundation and a new upstart or challenge. But since I was a graduate student in 1976, the Chomsky view has always been on the defensive. When I was in graduate school, it was the disciples of Jean Piaget. It was then the researchers in good old-fashioned artificial intelligence like Roger Schenck. Then it was the connectionists and the dynamical systems theorists. So there's actually never a consensus or an establishment view. And I've always thought that it was a false dichotomy in the sense that absolutely learning language depends on usage. I mean, whether you speak English or Hebrew or Spanish or Swahili depends completely on which community you were brought up in, and all of our vocabulary and all of the idioms and the word orders and the morphology, they are all acquired. The question is, acquired with what? The question about of universals, of innateness, pertains to what it is that does the learning. And so to say that learning takes place, experience matters, the input matters, is kind of beside the point. Yeah, of course it does. But the thing is that you take a child, you take a cat or a chimpanzee, you give them the same input, and they end up with different abilities. And the question is, what is responsible for those differences? And probably a better way of putting it is there any specialization in the learning abilities that allow us to speak and comprehend, as opposed to more generic abilities to learn to move, to learn to see, to learn how the physical world works? And partly that's going to be a question of modeling. That is, what is the least language-specific innate machinery you can get away with? And there is a challenge. It could be that with the recent increase in usability of deep learning networks, which are a modern version of the connectionist or artificial neural networks of the 80s, maybe they will show that that's all you need. All you need is an interconnected network of hundreds of millions of neurons, and you train it up, and you end up with a child. I doubt it, and I don't think that any of the systems now have the ability to understand in the way that a child does, namely to answer questions, to come up with new appropriate sentences. But that would be one of the battlegrounds in which this question can be intelligently pursued. And another is more empirical, namely in humans, do you get the same pattern of ability and non-ability for language and everything else? Do you get dissociations? Can you have patterns of brain damage? Can you have patterns of genetic disorders or differences where you have the ability to speak without the ability to learn other things, or vice versa? That, I think, is a better way to scientifically understand the issues than to say, well, does learning matter? Does input matter? Does experience matter? Well, yeah, of course it matters. But the question is, and this has been a theme, not a new idea, this is what I've been saying since I started writing about language as a graduate student. The issue is simply, what do the learning mechanisms consist of?
Mm.
Yeah. Sorry, Sherry.
No, just quickly, just for the sake of our non-linguistic audiences, well, a part of what we're discussing here, just to simplify that, is that Chomsky argues that sometime within the last 200 or so thousand years, that suddenly there was this mental burst. There's some kind of a genetic shift that resulted in the emergence of language, and there is considerable debate within the field of linguistics about, well, that happening, and also about how language installs itself onto the mind. So, carry on, Ghil'ad, as you were.
I asked Chomsky about falsifiability and whether it was important. I got the feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sherry, that he did not care too much about falsifiability, in the sense that, you have a theory and you can falsify it, and then maybe 100 years later, suddenly all the falsifications look out of place. Do you believe that universal grammar is unfalsifiable? I'm asking now, Steve.
Well, it depends how it's formulated. It can be unfalsifiable, and that would not be a good thing. And again, it's not I would not take literal falsifiability in the sense of the what Alan Newell once called the Skeet shooting model of science. Namely, you throw up a theory and then you aim a bullet at it, and either you shoot it to smithereens or you miss. But certainly our credence in a theory should be incremented based on empirical data. And so it's not kind of all or none. The theory is dead or alive. You adjust your credence. So part of the problem is that no one, I think it's a valid criticism of the Chomskyan program, that there's never really been a good characterization of what universal grammar is. Chomsky denies, and there's a good argument that it's simply a list of the lowest common denominator among the world's 6,000 languages. That is the intersection of what they all have in common. That was kind of closer to the Greenberg program that was pre-Chomskyan. He used to equate it with the language acquisition ability of the child. And so universal grammar was really an abstract characterization of learning mechanism. That's kind of the way, what I think is the ultimate target. As a psychologist who wants to kind of import from the best linguistics a good characterization of what indeed is universal in language, I found it kind of frustrating that the linguists have never really gotten their act together to state what universal grammar really is. From Chomsky, it's just whatever my theory happens to be this year. That's universal grammar. So it's not literally a list of properties of language, which could obviously be falsified if you find a language that doesn't have them. Now, again, I think that can be done too simplistically. If there are 6,000 languages and you have one that seems to be an exception, there could be exceptional circumstances in that language's history. It could be that the feature that we're talking about is covert, so that it doesn't necessarily, it may be involved in the mental computations underlying the language, but not clear how to identify it in particular constructions. So I will certainly grant the complexity of identifying universal grammar in both languages themselves and speakers. But ultimately, it's got to make some contact with real data, otherwise it's not a scientific theory.
Right. I would like to ask you a couple of general questions before Sherry delves into Israel and politics. Firstly, the distinction of Archilokos or Isaiah Berlin between a hedgehog and a fox. Well, how do you see yourself? Because for some people, you're kind of very foxy, but I think that you might find some motifs that that you can find everywhere. Any book you write, you might. So how do you see yourself, as a hedgehog or as a fox?
I've had hedgehog phases. I was for a number of years. I was obsessed with irregular verbs, and
they're not mutually exclusive.
No, that's true. And I said it's in the great academic tradition of knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. But even when I was interested in irregular verbs, there was an ulterior motive, which was to understand cognitive computation. And the reason that I studied it, the contrast between irregular and regular morphology, is that I argued with Alan Prince and others that it revealed the contrast between memory and computation, which are the two components in any computational system that irregulars like break, broke, go, went, man, men, goose, geese, did not follow a rule, so they had to be memorized as we memorize the lexicon, most of the lexical items, whereas the ability to generate new forms, wug, wugs, rick, ricked, cannot depend on memory, has to involve concatenation, merging, unification, affixation, online computation, and so it revealed the another component of human mental computation. So even there, it was a hedgehog in the service of foxy ambitions. And you know, I have written about a variety of topics, often because one thing leads to another. So maybe even that I'm kind of a serial hedgehog. Even the transition from language instinct to enlightenment now, there was a kind of meandering path where one thing led to another. The language instinct ended with a discussion of language and human nature, where well, if language is a human adaptation, what are the others? That led, and I thought intuitive biology, a sense of kinship, an intuitive physics might be other cognitive specializations or mental modules. That led to how the mind works, and it raised the question of where do these cognitive and other mental adaptations come from? Is there such a thing as human nature? That led to the blank slate, namely, what are the arguments that were not blank slates, and why has
I've got that one right here.
Oh, very good, yes.
I've got the rest too, but they're a little bit far away.
Steve, you know, there is some hedgehog kind of overarching element that I'm saying it ad lib, which is kind of the Apollonian tendency towards harmony and order. Even, I mean, when you talk about enlightenment now, and when you talk about violence being kind of in decline, when you talk about the regularity of ed in the verbs, etc., there is this kind of striving for order, harmony. I mean, so if this is the case, then of course it is more hedgehoggy than foxy.
Now, are you referring to my view of the world and history, or are you referring to my own style?
Your own research and style, apropos the book in which you talk about how to have a good academic style. But there is some kind of a if you want, an overarching umbrella motif, and this leads me to the next question, with Sherry's permission, and this is how culturally Jewish are your linguistics, your research, your books? I mean, I know you're an atheist, thank God, but the question is, but on the other hand, you're very Jewish. You're. I mean, it's obvious. Do you see some of your research as Jewish or motivated by Jewish education in your beginning years in Montreal, or I mean, where do you sit here?
Yeah, I think it's you know, I wouldn't say that the ideas or the justification are Jewish or anything, because that would cast doubt on how valid they are if they have such a specific cultural origin. And there is a distinction in the philosophy of science between, I think it's the logic of discovery and the logic of justification. So how you come up with ideas depends on your autobiography, your culture, your history, your idiosyncrasies, what you read last night. How you justify it depends, one hopes, on validity, consistency, conformity to reality. So we're talking about the logic of discovery. You know, I think so. I certainly grew up in an environment of debate, argument, discussion. You know, the saying 10 Jews, 11 opinions. So that was part of my background. I do make use of Jewish humor, Yinglish, of Jewish ethical debates as a source of ideas. I grew up in a pretty Zionist background. Since I was not religious, what Judaism had kind of become in my Reformed Jewish community was in large part Zionism. I don't consider myself a Zionist, but that was very much part of my my background, and I have an interest in Israel as just this weirdly fascinating country. So all of those kind of are help contribute the stock of ideas that I often play with, but I hope it doesn't lead to the actual content of my beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into that then. Steve, while we're on that, we have a lot of viewers tuned in from Israel, and both Ghil'ad and I have lots of subscribers in that country, and we're obviously, it goes without saying, quite involved in, well, I am anyway, I'm involved in a lot of the Zionist advocacy work. So tell us, I mean, you follow this space closely. There was an opportunity given to the other side about 6 months ago through the Trump peace plan, and sadly, that's been rejected. Do you see a future? Do you see well, what is the future ahead? Is there a solution from your point of view?
Well, I probably like most people had thought of the two-state solution as the only viable outcome. Now that it seems to be receding farther away, I'm open to persuasion about a binational state might be going too far, but I think that one way or another, millions of Palestinians have to be citizens of a country. They have to be able to vote. They have to have legal equality. That means that there are only two solutions. One of them is that they are a part of the state of Israel as full citizens, and the other is that they are citizens in a state of Palestine. The idea of it giving parts of the West Bank to Jordan doesn't seem to be particularly viable. That was the third option, but I assume that hasn't been taken seriously for quite some time. So we're in a period of enough flux where an idea that I would have rejected until recently, namely a state that is not, that respects the national identities both of Palestine and Israel in a single government with a universal franchise, might need another look. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I would argue for it as opposed to a two-state solution. But I would not think that having, what is the population of Gaza and West Bank now?
So Gaza's about 1.9 million. They ran it up to 2, and the West Bank is heavily disputed. I've seen it, projected as low as 2 million to as high as 4.5. I think the accurate number is probably somewhere close to 2.7 to 2.8 million. But I agree with you that something's got to be done with those people. It's a matter of figuring out where they will have their political status.
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about almost 4 million people, and there's just no way you can justify having 4 million people who can't vote in a country and don't have full legal equality. So one way or another, that ought to be rectified.
Sure. And this is look, and this is part of the reason why I personally had hoped and wished that 6 months ago, when the Trump plan was offered, that there would have been at least a response from the other side. Sadly, there hasn't been, and this, I think, at least from my point of view, sadly, that has been the consistent pattern. Even you go back more than a decade ago with Ehud Olmert offering his version of the two-state solution. There was a similar sort of a story. There is a reluctance to engage, and obviously they have their reasons for that, which we wouldn't have time to get into now. Look, I do want to move on to another topic, and this may be our final topic given time constraints, Steve, and it sort of sums up, in a sense. It's connected with what we were talking about before with Enlightenment. It's connected with free speech. That is the topic of defending Western civilization in its current form. I want to be absolutely clear, because I always have this sort of argument thrown at me from opponents and critics that when you talk about defending Western civilization, are you talking about the events of World War II? Are you talking about slavery and genocide? Because Western civilization isn't entirely as rosy as conservatives make it out to be. It's more than just the Magna Carta and the Enlightenment. But at the same time, we can acknowledge as I think, as objective observers, we can acknowledge that at the same time, it's not as horrible as some people will make it out to be. Some of the proponents of the Black Lives Matter campaign, or some of the proponents of cancel culture. So before I move on to you, before I invite you for a comment, Steve, I want to give you my somewhat different understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about Western civilization. Western civilization, when you demarcate it from other civilizations, you've got to put into it some kind of a unique characteristic that makes Western Western. Otherwise, you know, what's the difference between Bulgaria and Turkey? They, you know, resemble each other. They eat the same kind of food. Their culture is not really that far apart. If you cross the border, you wouldn't know that you've crossed over from Bulgaria to Turkey. Why is it that one is in Islamic civilization and the other is roughly in Western civilization? So my own response, if I can just quickly wrap that up, is I see the distinct characteristic of Western civilization that makes it Western is that it is a civilization that has given birth to competing ideas. So, for example, you look at the fact that, you know, someone like Richard Dawkins is as much a representative of Western civilization. He's a product of Western civilization, as would be Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church. And I recently participated in a Friedman debate with some academics. And I made that point, and I said, when we're talking about defending Western civilization, essentially what we're talking about is defending this laboratory of competing ideas. I mean, you look at the debates about dogmatism versus skepticism, Catholicism versus Protestantism, socialism versus capitalism, libertarianism versus liberalism versus conservatism, nationalism versus globalism. They're all Western ideas, right? That level of internal dissent, I'm not entirely convinced that in the current time frame that there are other civilizations, if we can use the Huntingtonian model, where the level of dissent is as pronounced. Would you, first of all, agree with that diagnosis, and would you agree that this tradition is something that we need to defend?
No, not exactly. And right. Even though when I wrote Enlightenment Now, some of my fans said, yes, a defense of Western civilization. I said, well, you know, not exactly. For one thing, you know, the Enlightenment had to be kind of developed within the West over the tooth and nail opposition of the church and monarchies, and then afterwards of militant nationalisms and Soviet communism and fascism and Nazism. So Enlightenment thinking can't be equated with the West, although a lot of it came out of the West. And in terms of what we want to defend, it's certainly fine to pick the kind of the greatest hits out of Western civilization and try to marginalize all the stuff like, you know, like monarchy, like church dogma. But on the other hand, there are ideas and components that the West has taken from other civilizations, themselves amalgams of ideas from large catchment areas. Gandhi's nonviolent resistance, for example, influenced from British sources, but also Jain and Hindu, and other civilizations like classical Islamic civilization, Mughal India. In general, when good things happen, they tend to be from civilizations that are not chauvinistic or inward-looking, but that pick and choose the best from everywhere. And that's why, and that I think would be true of Enlightenment ideals. A lot of them came out of Western thinkers, but you know, some didn't. Those thinkers were in turn influenced by ideas far and wide, and that we shouldn't even frame it as hooray for the West. There are some really good ideas like science, like democracy, like humanism, like reason. Like free speech. And the West has been inconsistent, a little squirrely in standing up for them, as we see even today with the government of the United States, not exactly the most pro-science, pro-reason government the world has seen, despite it being pretty Western. So I don't frame it as Western civilization, though I would frame it as Enlightenment ideals. And of course, that itself is an Enlightenment ideal, because if it's any good, it doesn't belong to any particular tribe or ethnic group. That wouldn't make it good. It's good because we can defend it. And if we can defend it, anyone can defend it, because the rules of the game, reason, human flourishing, are universal, according to Enlightenment thinking.
Sure, and look, and that's for the most part consistent with what I'm saying. I guess that the West. I mean, first of all, when we talk about the West, the question becomes, well, how do you define the West? Are we talking about a culture? Are we talking about a religion or whatever? I certainly don't throw religion into the mix, even though it's part of the ingredients. Christianity, 381 onwards, 381 AD onwards, that's definitely been part of the mix, but it's not the sole ingredient. Obviously, there was, Greco-Roman philosophy, there was skepticism, there was all of those things. And often a lot of these ideas canceled each other out. And the fascinating thing is that today we're at this juncture where in academia, I feel that there is somewhat an oversaturation of certain types of opinions over others. And I know that you've been part of a project called the Heterodox Academy. Did you want to tell our viewers a little bit about that and what it's intending to accomplish?
Yes, Heterodox Academy was founded by the psychologist Jonathan Haidt and some collaborators in order to, for one thing, extol the virtue of viewpoint diversity, heterodoxy, to try to push back against the political monoculture that has taken over not just American universities, but many European and Australian universities as well. I'm not sure about Israeli universities. My understanding is that in large parts of Israel's universities, the same kind of hard left monoculture has taken root. So the idea is that a variety of opinions is a good thing, not just because diversity is great and hooray for variety and 1,000 flowers bloom, but there is a deep reason behind it, which is that no one's infallible. No one has arrived at the one eternal truth. Again, I would say this comes out of Enlightenment skepticism, Enlightenment challenge of dogma and scripture, and the fact that knowledge, even though I do believe there is such a thing as there are true theories or more true and less true. I'm a moral realist. I think there are certain things that just are inherently wrong. However, none of us is saintly or brilliant enough to know what they are. We can only discover them by broaching ideas and then evaluating them for consistency, for empirical accuracy. If we disable the ability to broach ideas and we have a premature consensus that is then enforced by brute strength, by threats of firing, by censorship, then we're guaranteed to result in error, in factual error, in empirical, in logical error, in moral error. So heterodoxy, in the sense of you got to be able to try a variety of ideas, is I think an inherent virtue in the academy, is designed both to just endorse that value system and to provide a forum, an organization for people who do feel persecuted by the political correctness on so many campuses, to find, to explore where it's threatened, how to advance it, and those are its raison d'etre. Another organization that I'll mention, again, this is American, is called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is more of a legal organization that will stand up for students and professors that get censored, either by invoking the American First Amendment, which prohibits government from infringing on speech, and that applies to public universities, but for private universities, holding their feet to the fire when they have declarations that they do allow freedom of opinion, and to pounce on them when they don't.
Yeah, so I'm going to pass it on to Ghil'ad shortly to ask his final question, and then I think we'll be just about ready to wrap this up. So the only comment on that, Steve, and it ties in with almost everything we've discussed, also going back to the point about falsifiability, that there is a certain way in which ideas should be studied. So what I've often said to colleagues and friends is that if you're trying to research something, the very point of research is to learn through falsification rather through confirmation. Now, you would think that a principle as basic as that should be blatantly obvious, but as you well know, it's not. So what I say to people is, if you wake up one day and your gut instinct is that global warming is a complete hoax, which a lot of people believe, then you shouldn't just go on Google and just look for 10 websites that say that it's a hoax and then call that research, right? Then you should in fact go out of your way to challenge yourself and see what arguments there are for global warming. Whereas in a different case, if somebody wakes up and their gut instinct is that global warming is real, right? They should go and consider the alternative argument, right? And then come back and allow the ideas to collide inside your head. And then you're in a position to arrive at a judgment. Do you feel that this method is something that we need to get out there far and wide?
Oh, absolutely. Now, of course, you have to make judgments. You don't want to give equal weight to a well-vetted, well-tested body of knowledge and some kook with a website. So there can be a kind of false both-sidedness. But still, within a realm of people who are responsible for defending their opinions with evidence, it is essential to listen to not just both sides, because we forget that there are other, there are more than two sides. In the case of global warming, for example, there is a position, it's just been argued for by Bjorn Lomborg, that it is real, it is man-made, but that some of the attempts to mitigate it do more harm than good, that maybe we should learn to live with some amount of global warming. Now, that may be wrong, and it has been attacked, but it's good to know, if it is wrong, it's good to know why it's wrong. And because it helps us calibrate, given that we're not going to prevent global warming anyway, we do have to decide how much we can live with, because it's going to be costly to reduce it. Where do we find the optimal trade-off? So entertaining that family of ideas is essential to dealing with it.
Indeed, and looking as a historian, also following in that same point, I've often said to people often ask, they say, well, how come there are so many books called, the concise history of the world? There are, hundreds of books that have the same title. Is everyone talking about the same thing? In a sense, they are. But there is a difference. If there's 100 books called The Concise History of the World, it's because you've got 100 different, to put it bluntly, there's 100 different ways in which the argument is being spun. Everybody interprets things differently. So sometimes what I say to people is you've got to treat historical events and philosophical ideas as almost like court cases. There is a defendant's perspective, there's a plaintiff perspective, there's multiple interpretations. And once you learn the basic facts, you're in a position to act as the jury, right? A historian is essentially something like a magistrate who studies the past, based on forensics, based on primary sources, based on secondary sources, and what is being said in the peer-reviewed community, and comes up with her or his own verdict. Often, I think that interpretation side of things, that a lot of is based on interpretation, is very much. It's not as commonly realized as I wish it was. So someone will read one particular book, and they don't realize that what they've read is not only just a bunch of facts, just a rearrangement of facts, but they've also inherited the person's thesis. And they'll think that thesis is the fact. Now, if someone steps into the equation and says, yeah, no, I don't really see it that way, I'm in a different school of thought, that messes with their heads. Like, they'll be like, what? There's schools of thought. So anyway, look, I want to pass it on to Ghil'ad with his final question, and then we can wrap this up.
Thank you, Sherry. When I was listening to you and the discussion about Israel and Steve's response, I was reminded of the story about the rabbi who phones God from Jerusalem, which is only a local call, as you know. I don't know if you know this story, Steve. God says, I'm too busy, phone me later. And the rabbi insists, wait, I have two very important questions to ask you. So God says, shoot. Shoot, by the way, is shelot v'tshuvot, which means questions and answers in Hebrew. The rabbi asks the first question, will my daughter ever marry? God says, yes, but not in your lifetime. The rabbi is a little bit disappointed, but at least she will get married, which is very important for a rabbi, that his daughter gets married. What's your second question, asks God, the rabbi. The rabbi asks, will the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ever end? God says, yes, but not in my lifetime. So when you were discussing that, I was reminded of that. Now, Sherry, you mentioned the concise history of the world, and you have like hundreds of books that you read very fast to understand the complexity, etc. I remember listening to Amos Oz, Zal, Zichrono Livracha,
Recently passed away.
who passed away at All Souls in Oxford. And it's funny because he opened his lecture by saying that you have many courses today that teach you fast reading, you know, like how to read very, very fast. I'm going to teach you today slow reading, you know, how to read very, very slowly. So it doesn't work. And when you have Steve's books, they're big books, you know, it's not just like a concise, you know, like concise dictionary of mankind. So my question is related, and that's the final question from my perspective. You've discussed with Sherry the diversity of views that is required within the academic world, but my question is more general. What is the future of academia in general, and what is the future of the humanities in particular? And I would like just to mention two aspects. Firstly, the onlineization of education that COVID, of course, kind of corroborated, but it was heading this way for economic reasons anyway. The onlineization means maybe that one day there will only be Steve Pinker from Harvard teaching the entire introduction to linguistics in the world. So they will need no professors at universities across the world, because it will be a MOOC, or a massive open online course, and then you will have some tutors in universities around the world, so there will be no humanities in a way. And this is related to the transactionalization, the corporatization of universities around the world. Maybe Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and MIT are unique in the sense that they are still kind of, they can have professors in very small Talmudic departments. But by and large, as you know, Steve, many humanities departments are getting abolished. The recession that is coming, the tsunami, will mean that tens of thousands of professors will be fired, will be made redundant all of the world. Universities look more and more like TAFE. TAFE is like a college, community college. So you kind of prepare people for a specific vocation, like nursing or physiotherapists, etc. But then what about philosophy? What about theoretical subjects? So what is your view about the future of academia? Is it the case that universities will become rare? We will have TAFE for philosophy, boutique universities for philosophy?
A lot of profound questions, and probably the answers are diverse. Certainly, the American private university model, which is unusual across the world, where my students, at least their sticker price is $75,000 a year for 4 years. A lot of them, nonetheless, blow off lectures and classes, and they use it mainly as an opportunity for social networking. It's probably not an optimal use of parents and government funds. Having students on campus, we may learn, is less indispensable than we thought. And it may be that universities, like a lot of institutions, find that a lot of moving bodies around to be in the same physical space is not worth the cost. That what we're doing right now accomplishes what we want conversations and seminars to do, and we'll learn how much we can get at what cost when face-to-face contact is reduced as it necessarily is. Humanities, which is somewhat a separate question. There, I think there is cause for concern. I've written that some of the damage in the humanities has been self-inflicted, because of the hostile takeover, or not hostile, so hostile takeover of the humanities by postmodernism, the suffocating political correctness, the obscure jargon, the tendentious ideology, the isolation from scientific thinking. I tend to think that the humanities would be better off, would just be as exciting to students now as they were in the 60s, if there were more diversity of opinion, more clarity, more consilience with science, and and I think that any civilized society really has to have a vigorous study of the humanities. So it would be a tragedy if the humanities were allowed to be taken down by its more politicized and tendentious factions. In terms of whether there'll be a kind of whether universities will follow the model of say the entertainment industry, of manufacturing, where there will be kind of winner take all, where the most desired, most famous faculty will kind of put everyone else out of business. That partly hinges on the question of how much weight we end up putting in the face-to-face aspect, as opposed to the consumption of online lectures. I'm a little bit evading your question out of a kind of humility that when it comes to kind of adjustments of, there are two things, they're both good. What will we end up with? How much of one compared to another? Those, I think, are very hard to predict, and we're often surprised, and we may have to just let the experiment play itself out to see where we end up. But all of them profound questions, and ones that we at universities should really ask, because at least again, the American system is very eccentric and kind of bizarre in the almost mandatory residential requirement of highly expensive, obscenely expensive education with dubious benefits. There's a debate as to how much of the benefit of having a university degree comes from what you learn at university, as opposed to the university filtering out people who are smart and disciplined and just certifying them. A lot of debates that I think we at universities have been much too squeamish about having. Given how much money we wring out of our countries, it is legitimate to ask all the questions that you asked.
Okay, so that just about brings this to a close. All good things have to come to an end, and that applies to the present conversation, as much as I'd love to keep this going. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've been online for just over the past hour with two of the finest thinking men in the academic community around the world, and they've both been extremely generous with their time this morning, or what is tonight for Stephen. It's like a trip back in time where with this conversation with Steve on the other side of the world. You've got to love the day and age we're in with all the technology that is available. So Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann in Adelaide, Professor Steven Pinker over in the US, I believe you're in Cape Cod, did you say?
That is right.
Yes. We want to thank you both for your time. To keep track of future webinars on interesting topics like these, please consider liking my page, which is www.facebook.com/Sherry Sufi PhD. Steve and Ghil'ad are also both on Facebook, so please also feel free to like their pages and keep track of the great work both men are doing. If you want to purchase any of their books, they're available on their social media and on their websites. And last but not the least, if you're interested in an accessible book on language and nationalism, please head over to my website, which is www.sherrysufi.com, and order a copy of my book, which is this thing here. It's called From Cavemen to Countrymen, The Linguistic Roots of Nationalism. And Steve has been kind enough to provide a little review for that recently. So until next time, gentlemen, Ghil'ad, Steve, thank you very much for your time. And thank you, viewers.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks, Ghil'ad. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.